My guest on this episode of Suds Search is Barry Adams, owner of Polemic Digital, a specialized SEO consultancy based in Northern Ireland. Barry is an in-demand conference presenter and frequent trainer on topics related to technical SEO. A few places you might have heard Barry present include Brighton SEO, Ungagged, SMX Munich, SMX Paris, Pubcon, Chiang Mai SEO, and many other places. His consulting business has worked with some of the world's largest brands. Polemic Digital has won several awards, including the UK Search Awards, DANI Awards, and the coveted Global Business Insight Award. Barry has been optimizing websites since 1998. Over the course of his career, Barry's technical SEO audits have become the stuff of legend. We're going to spend a lot of our conversation asking about a range of topics related to technical SEO and best practices for auditing a website. I really like his speaking style. He pulls no punches, especially on topics that irritate him. He's never more engaging than when he's deep into a righteous, profanity-laced rant. Recently, Barry has started a newsletter called SEO for Google News. The newsletter focuses on the unique SEO needs of publishers. He's amassed an impressive subscriber list in a short period of time. Grab something cold to drink and join me for a conversation with Barry Adams. We'll talk about the limitations of relying on SEO tools to perform an audit, how to appeal to the different audiences receiving an audience, and we'll talk a little bit about his vulgarity competition with Greg Gifford. Barry Adams, welcome to Suds Search. How you doing?
Thanks. I'm doing great, Mark. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on. You're a very well-known technical SEO. You train people like me who want to level up their game on SEO audits for technical reasons. Kind of to set the table for our audience, I thought what I'd do is distinguish between technical SEO and on-page SEO, and I like the way you've done this in the past. Can you share that with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, I use the three pillars of SEO model, really, where the first pillar for me is the technical SEO, where I focus primarily on the crawling and indexing of websites by search engines. And I'm not really too bothered about what Google indexes, more that Google indexes it properly, can crawl and index all the right content on the website. So it's more about the interaction of Googlebot with a website and making that more efficient and as frictionless as possible, really. We're talking about all kinds of things here in technical SEO with load speed, crawl budget, HTTP server codes, those sorts of things. Also code quality. So basically everything that impacts with how efficiently Google can find and extract content from websites, that is what I would qualify as technical SEO. So rather than look at the skills, some people would say, well, if it's a technical skill, it means technical SEO. I'm looking more at the technical part of a website that interacts with Googlebot as seeing technical SEO. And of course, all of the skills associated with optimizing websites that way are technical skills, but sometimes it's also just more or less problem solving or, understanding how Google works in general.
Interesting. And so I saw one of your presentations where you said, even though you're a technical SEO, you said to prioritize things backwards from what a technical SEO might think. So start with ranking issues because those are the easiest to get to. Walk us through how you prioritize backwards and why you believe that's the best way to do things.
Yeah, I mean, technical SEO can get very hard to get buy-in into large organizations, especially because it's generally not things that result in quick payoffs for most websites. Whereas if you prioritize backwards, you start with ranking and then you go to indexing and then you go to technical. With optimizing for ranking, it means that you look at content that's already been crawled and indexed, but isn't performing well in ranking for whatever reasons. And if you can get that fixed, if you can make some improvements there, it tends to have a fairly quick payoff in the context of SEO, where sometimes this stuff can take months or even years to pay off. But if you prioritize backwards and you find some quick wins for content that's already called an index, but whose ranking can be further improved, maybe with better internal linking or updated on-page content or whatever it is, you get that traffic boost fairly quickly. And that means you tend to get more buy-in. You get that sense of excitement in an organization that, hey, this stuff actually works. We can see tangible benefits from doing this, which is why I recommend prioritizing that way. You start with the ranking issues, you move down to indexing issues, and then lastly, you tackle the technical issues. Now, that's always, of course, with the caveat that if there's major technical issues that prevent the entire website from performing, you will want to tackle those fairly urgently. Yeah. So it's always in the context of what kind of impact a specific issue has, which is why you need to look more at, issues of similar importance and then decide that to prioritize backwards. If you have issues that have roughly the same amount of impact in terms of getting them fixed and the amount of traffic improvement you could theoretically expect from that, then you prioritize for ranking issues first, and then indexing issues, and then crawling issues last.
It's very interesting. And you mentioned it in your answer there, the audiences. So eventually this audit gets completed and it's given to a group of stakeholders. Who's in that meeting and what are their motivations?
Yeah, I mean, I roughly identify three audiences that I come across whenever I do audits and deliver audits for my clients. The people who tend to hire you most of the time are the marketers, the people who are in charge of growing audiences and growing traffic to a website. So they're what I call the middle audience. You don't want to dumb it down too much for them. They tend to have a good, fairly basic grasp, or sometimes a really good grasp of SEO and what they can accomplish. But they might not necessarily be full-blown technical SEOs or developers. So you need to put things in the right context for them. And generally make them look good, because they're the ones who hire you. So, your job is to make their decisions look good to bring you on board and get stuff done with you. Then you've got the decision makers who are the ones who sign off on the budgets. They don't care about the detail. They don't care about, this fix or that fix or who's to blame for what particular problem. They just want to see improvement. They want to know that if they're going to spend resources on this, that is going to pay off. So for those participants, you want high-level overviews, you want quick summaries, you want nice-looking graphs, and get the message across with minimal lingo and minimal fuss and maximum emphasis on what the potential results of implementing these fixes is going to be. And then, of course, the last group is the developers, who tend to be the ones who have to actually implement this. And developers are constantly being pulled in 17 different directions at once. Everybody has the most urgent tickets that immediately need implemented right now, and they have to decide which ones go first, which ones go second, etc. So you have to sort of understand the context in which they do their work, in which they have to make these fixes. It helps if you understand the lingo a little bit, if you have a bit of a development background yourself, or at least are familiar with the processes and tools that go into development. And I find it very important when talking to developers is to not always tell them how to do something, but to give them an outcome. As in, this is ideally how your website should interact with Google, and this is why it's important. And if you provide that context, you sometimes come across developers who get the solution better than you did yourself. It's fairly common that a developer comes up with a more elegant solution to a problem than I would have envisaged in my own head, because they know their website better than I do as an external consultant. They're more familiar with the technology. You have to be a little bit careful in that if their understanding of the issue is incomplete, they come up with a solution that makes things worse or is just not quite what it's supposed to be, which is why it's important to have a bit of an ongoing dialogue and especially make them feel that they can rely on you to also fight in their corner and not make them feel stupid or anything, but that you're there to help and make sure that your goals and their goals align, which is ideally to make the website better so that it can get more traffic and make more money for everybody involved.
It makes perfect sense. I wanted to ask you about tools. So SEO tools are all the rage. This week, SEMrush announced that they're going to be IPOing. They have a tool at SEMrush, I should say. That's the right way to pronounce it. SEMrush, to do a site audit. They call it a site auditor tool. You mentioned devs in your last answer. I've had devs come back to me and say, I had a Lighthouse score of 90. Why are you do you think you know better than Google? What are the limitations of tools? I think this is a real misunderstood concept among devs, among marketers, among all the people in your audience, that there are severe limitations to every one of these tools, even Lighthouse. How do you respond to those sort of questions?
I always explain it in the way that tools are data gatherers, they're not data analyzers. A tool can only show you the data. They can never provide context to that data. That's why you still need people to use the data, analyze it, and turn it into actionable insights. It's the same with web analytics. Web analytics can only show you the data. it can't tell you what you need to do with it. And SEO tools are no different there. You need to understand the context in which these errors creep up, and when a tool reports them, it doesn't always mean that it has to be fixed straight away, or even that it has to be fixed, period, because it might just be a feature of a particular platform or a technology that is unfixable or shouldn't even be fixed because other things depend on it. Because the best SEO audit tools, I sort of resent them calling them audit tools because they're not audit tools. They're crawlers, they're data gatherers. They're not audit tools. So they can help you a lot, and I'm a fan of using them. I use a whole range of crawlers myself for every single project. But they just gather data that I then need to analyze and parse and put in the context of that particular website's challenges and struggles so that I can make the right kind of recommendations. And, it's really frustrating when you see agencies or SEO consultants provide a white labeled report generated by a tool and call that an audit, because it's not. It's at best the starting point of an actual audit. It's not an audit in and of itself. It lacks context, it lacks meaning. It's just a list of things that are automatically generated. And that is almost useless when you're trying to decide what you're actually going to spend your resources on. I'll give you an example from my own history. A client came to me and said, we have 800,000 for error messages in Google Search Console, and our audit tool says that's absolutely terrible. And I'm like, yeah, okay, you've got 800,000, but you run a 25 million page website with a very high content churn. This is not your priority, people. It really isn't. This is negligible. You don't worry about this. Google reports them as 404s because it feels that you need that information, but it's up to you to decide what you're actually going to do with that and whether or not that's important enough to, focus on efforts on, spend resources on. The same with title tags. Our title tags are too long. Too long for what? And how many? We're talking about 400 pages of 2 million page website. That's not worth your effort. Also, the deeper pages, they're way buried down in the site. Context is everything. Context is for kings, as quote from the Star Trek Discovery. I loved that whole first season, by the way. So that you have to provide context, and the audit tools cannot do that. They're just software. They use heuristics to show you some quick wins and reports that can get you started on that audit journey, but it is just the start. It is never the finished product.
It's very interesting. I mean, I think the context point especially is important. And ultimately what you'll do instead is create a report in Word, never in PowerPoint, that is around 20 to 30 pages in length. It's very succinct. It says, this is what's wrong, this is how to fix it, and this is why. Just a kind of an oddball question, but why not PowerPoint? Why is that a problem? Why does it have to be in Word?
I mean, this is more my own personal preference, but I have seen it work better because I find in PowerPoint, I don't have the space to provide that level of context that is needed to explain an issue, why it's important, and how it should actually be fixed, or what the ideal outcome scenario would be. I find I can do it in 25 pages in a Word document, which I save as a PDF and send to the client, plus maybe 1 or 2 Excel sheets of extra data. Whereas if I were to put the same level of information in a PowerPoint, it would be a 200-slide PowerPoint deck, which is massive, and nobody's going to read through that. I think people would feel more comfortable with a printable document that they can print out and read through and maybe underline things and highlight some things, copy-paste things from, rather than a PowerPoint presentation, which is meant to be presented. It's a presentation format for large audiences. It is not an educational format. And I try to see my audits as an education moment rather than a presentation moment. As in, it's not just this is wrong with your website, it's also why this is wrong with your website and why there is value in fixing these things. And I can't do that in a presentation. A presentation is for a conference where I stand on stage and I yell obscenities about SEO and Google for 25 minutes. And you do not for delivering an audit to clients. Yeah.
Well, very good. I heard another thing that you said in one of your presentations that really surprised me. So you said that if you're lucky, about half of your recommendations will get implemented. And that's surprising because, after all, you're getting paid for the site audit by the client, and you're one of the leading experts in the world on technical site audits. How do you account for that? Only half of your recommendations ever getting implemented.
Part of it is because of the sheer speed with which SEO generally moves, and I probably underestimated a bit by half. I mean, realistically, it's more like 2/3, and they tend to be the 2/3 most important ones, the high priority ones. I do put a lot of effort into trying to make my audits as actionable as possible and removing any ambiguity and showing the value of what I recommend. And I've gotten better at that over the years. It's a constant learning process. I think I get better with every audit that I do and the way I present it, and every interaction with a client when it comes to delivering audits and implementing them is a learning moment for me as well to improve on those skills. In my early years as a consultant, I saw the audit as sort of the finished product, and that's what they pay me for, and there you go, and whether or not you do anything with it is up to you. But conversations with other SEOs and opinions from other people in the industry have really taught me that that isn't a healthy approach, that isn't good for the SEO industry as a whole, let alone for me as a consultant, that I need to work harder to make sure that the audits are a point of value for the client, that they actually see a financial benefit from in the long run. So I've started to put much more emphasis on making my recommendations more implementable. But realistically, I've got usually between 10 and 15 recommendations in an audit report. And if it's, say, 15 recommendations and the last 5 are low priority, I don't necessarily want the client to actually get to those 5 last recommendations. I feel obliged to put them in there because I do think they might be worthwhile if they have extra resources available. If they've got spare time for their developers to maybe work on these things, because I think in the long run, those sorts of recommendations like minimizing internal redirects or fixing 404 errors, it's just good for site health. But at the same token, if a client actually gets to the stage where they can implement those low priority recommendations, they're probably not doing the right things to bring their website forward, because they're sort of fiddling in the margins rather than trying to go for bigger problems to fix and bigger gains to make in general across the whole website. Developers who are twiddling their thumbs finding out things to do, that's sort of the hallmark of a stagnating website in general, a website that's not evolving, that's not growing, that's not trying to reach the next level of success in whatever industry there is. So I don't expect clients to have the resources to implement every single recommendation that I make them in an audit. I hope they put effort into the main ones, the high priority and medium priority ones. The low priority ones, I want them to almost ignore because there's bigger fish to fry. There's other improvements to make on their website, maybe better designs, maybe new content areas, maybe more structural improvements, you name it, that are not necessarily SEO related, but just generally focused on the whole success of the website. And I don't want clients to have the luxury of fixing those low priority items, because if they end up spending time and money on fixing those low priority items, that is time and money not spent on growing the website in other, probably more meaningful ways.
That's a really interesting, like the evolution of your career was interesting. Do you find that a lot of people do just try and keep the website static, not make many changes after they've done an audit, and that could be a kiss of death for an SEO campaign?
Yeah, I think you sort of find those types of clients on occasion where getting an audit done is just a tick box on some marketing manager's annual performance review, and they don't have any real incentive to do anything more than that. And it saddens me, because you sort of know that audit is going to disappear into a person's drawer somewhere and barely get looked at because it's a tick box, it's done.
Right.
But there's companies like that, and realistically, for those sorts of companies, their website is probably not their biggest source of new leads, new prospects, new business. They have other channels for that. But I like working with clients where the website is a key marketing and sales channel, a key driver of business for that company. And I want companies to put proper effort into growing that website and growing their web presence in general, and tapping into all the different audience channels at their disposal, not just search. I always make it very clear to my clients that I am an SEO guy. I have an SEO hammer. for me, everything looks like an SEO nail.
Right,
That
right.
doesn't mean that they should have the same approach. They should have a broader perspective on all the different channels. And when I say do this, but it completely contradicts something else that they're doing in another channel, it's up to them to make that evaluation of whether or not it's worth doing, or maybe finding some sort of compromise. Because you don't want to cut off one channel so that another one can grow. Ideally, you want to find ways so that they both can grow.
I like that self-awareness. That's very interesting. Before I let you go, I want to make sure I promote something. You have a new newsletter. As of this airing, you've produced 5 newsletters. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the newsletter and where they can go to sign up?
Yeah, it's a newsletter specifically for people who are interested in SEO for news publishers, because news publishers have a bit of a different dynamic than what I call classic or general SEO, in that they have a very limited opportunity for the bulk of their organic search traffic, which is top stories, carousels, and Google News. And top stories, carousels especially, are an enormous driver of traffic to news publishers, regardless of what kind of news they publish. But it has a shelf life of maximum 48 hours, which means it's a very different dynamic compared to general SEO, where you're trying to build long-term ranking, long-term value. So there's slightly different rules that publishers have to play by to get traction in Google, to get included in Google News, and to consistently appear in those top stories boxes that we see more and more. I think on average, Google shows a top stories box for about 10% of all their search queries, which, in Google's huge trillion search ecosystem is a lot of top stories boxes. And I couldn't find an awful lot of information out there about SEO for publishers specifically that was up to date and accurate. And I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of publishers over the years. I spent a year in-house at a local news publisher when I first came to Northern Ireland. And I've had a lot of good publishing projects over the last 5-6 years now. So it's become sort of my specialty. I used to be a pure technical SEO, then I got more and more work with news publishers, and now I've worked with some of the biggest news publishers. I still work with a lot of big name news publishers all around the world. And I thought, right, there's not a lot of information out there specifically for publishers, so why don't I just start writing about that myself? And I thought a little bit about what kind of format I should use for that. And, I like email as a channel. It's probably my second favorite audience channel after search, obviously, because it's opt-in. It's people who actively want to receive your information. And it's a commitment channel as well. People are more committed to reading your content if they sign up to your email newsletter versus somebody just reading a blog on occasion and knowing, that blog is always going to sit there. I can just dip in and out whenever I want. So I started a newsletter. It's on SEOforGoogleNews.com. I reached the 1,000 subscriber mark last week, which I'm really, really proud of. And it keeps gaining traction and gets bigger and bigger with every edition that I send out. And I'm really involved in trying to make it as useful as possible, and not just providing very basic entry-level stuff about, this is a keyword that you put into your headline, but more about, the really interesting challenges that publishers might face, like how does it fit into a newsroom, what kind of effort should we put on optimizing technical aspects, and also trying to use it as a way to keep people up to date of what's happening in news in the context of search in general, because it's a very fast-moving space at the moment, with Google making all these updates and having really interesting evolution of how Google uses news in its ecosystem, and how news publishers can capitalize on that to capture the biggest possible share of traffic, really.
It's such an interesting niche. I mean, we've had over 50 episodes of Suds Search now, and I think I talked to one publisher SEO, and it felt like we were doing very different things. I'll say that. A local SEO and a publisher SEO are doing very different things on a daily basis. All right, so Barry, this is everyone's favorite part of the show. This is where Greg gives me a question. He gives me no context to the question, so I don't really know. It's kind of a high wire act for both of us. Today, do you have some sort of competition with Greg? He said to ask Barry about your guys' competition.
Well, Greg and I both speak at conferences, at least when we were still allowed to go to places and speak at conferences. And there's a bit of a friendly competition who can squeeze the most F-bombs into a conference talk. I'll be entirely honest. Well, Greg and I have that informal competition. The crown goes to Lisa Myers, or Lisa Detlefsen. I think she resumed her maiden name. I think she managed to squeeze 29 F-bombs into a 20-minute talk once at the conference in Dublin. My record stands at 17 in a 30-minute talk. I'm not sure what Greg's is. I think Greg beat me at the last Brighton SEO. I think you had slightly over 20, Greg. You did really well. So it's just, sometimes a conference topic lends itself to a proper rant. And for me, when I rant, the F-bombs just come naturally. I don't even think about it. They just pop out. It depends on the kind of talk. If it's more of a strategic talk or, a tactical knowledge dump, the F-bombs aren't particularly common, but sometimes I just really go off on one. I gave a talk in the Netherlands once. This was a funny one, a little anecdote. There was a conference where they had a Googler, 2 ex-Googlers, and a Google fanboy all up on stage just before me. And then the organizer said, right, we've heard a lot of pro-Google content right now, so to offer counterbalance to the previous 4 talks, here is Barry Adams. And I just went off on a rant about how Google is, potentially a detriment to the free and open web, sucking up all our private information, yada yada, all the stuff past review. And there was a fairly sweary one, and probably one of the best talks I've ever given, because I just got to rant on stage for 25 minutes, and it feels good, It feels good when you get the audience along with you as well, and there's the laughs at the right moment. And I have noticed, though, for a US audience, the F-bombs can land a bit iffy if you're targeting an audience that isn't used to that sort of style of delivering a conference talk. In Europe, it's almost mandatory, especially if you do anything on the island of Ireland, where the F-bomb isn't even really considered a swear word. It's more like an accent to punctuate your speech with, really.
Right. Well, you heard it here first. That's the score to beat is Lisa's at 29. And I'm sure Greg's going to shoot for that for sure. So, well, Barry, this has been really fun. I want to just make sure people know how to contact you. What are your favorite social media platforms, website? Where can people contact you?
I deleted my Facebook and Instagrams because they were just, soul destroying. I'm only active on Twitter nowadays. It's Badams, Badams on Twitter. I have a LinkedIn account, and people send me a message there on occasion, but most of the time I forget to respond or only see it several days later, so don't try LinkedIn. Shoot me an email. My website is www.polemicdigital.com, or just Google Barry Adams SEO. I hope I still rank first for that. I'm the other Barry in SEO. Barry Schwartz is the big guy. I'm the other Barry in SEO. So yeah, drop me a line on Twitter, follow me on Twitter, or via the website. I have an open email policy, by the way. I try to be generous with my time and knowledge. Whenever anybody asks me a question on Twitter or via email, I always try to be helpful and provide an answer. So yeah, do make use of that if you want.
Well, you've certainly been generous with your time and knowledge today on Suds Search. I will give you a virtual cheers. Let's sign off for now. I'll see everybody next week. Barry, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, man. Cheers.